Some women don't just survive one hard relationship, they survive a pattern. Years spent trying to love someone out of addiction, years of walking on eggshells, years of believing that staying was the most loving, faithful, or godly thing to do, until their own soul begins to disappear. Today's story is for every woman who stayed longer than she wished she had, who is grieving the years lost, and who wonders if it's still possible to break the cycle and become whole again. Are you tired of repeating the same patterns, feeling stuck in your story, and wondering if real change is even possible? In my book, Unstuck, Break Free from What's Holding You Back and Create a Life You Love, I walk you through the path from survival to transformation, blending faith, neuroscience, and soul-deep healing. This book, it's not just words on a page. It's a companion for your journey. Whether you've experienced trauma or just feel lost in the noise of life, Unstuck will meet you there with truth, compassion, and tools that actually work. It's time to stop surviving and start living your story with purpose. Grab your copy today on Amazon. Thanks for joining me on the It's Your Story to Tell podcast. I'm your host, Megan Babcock, and today I'm joined by Julie Bonn Blank. Thank you, Julie, for being here. I'm excited for our conversation.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here with you. I'm honored.
Julie has been working in the space of survivorship. She supports women who are healing, who have been in all different types of difficult, traumatic situations. We're going to talk to her about her own journey and what God has placed on her heart through the different ministry work she does. So, Julie, I'm going to let you just start telling us a little bit about your story.
I'm happy to chat with you all today. And I want you to know that even though we're talking a little bit today about various trauma and that addiction and abuse, are often in people's histories, that they are not the same problem. They are separate problems. And in my experience, I was in 3 unhealthy relationships throughout my life. And eventually I got to a point where I was like, what is the common denominator? And of course, it was me. And I had to start looking, at me and what I was doing. And as I looked at my own healing and found the groups I needed to heal, God walked me through even more. He had much greater planned for me, as he does for you if you are also in this situation. I wanted to mention that just because the route that we're talking today can make people think that they're one and the same. And I still hear from a lot of ladies that feel that, if he didn't smoke weed, this wouldn't have happened. If he wasn't drunk, this never would have happened. If he wasn't addicted to pills, it wouldn't have been, that bad. In reality, in the professional space, as we treat these people, they both need treated separately. And sometimes the addiction needs treated even before any, misbehavior, mistreatment can be treated as well, because it gets in the way of learning and a behavioral therapy. And so, yes, I have a great heart for ladies that have been in this situation. Early on, I felt like when I was searching for my healing and I had found a Christian abuse recovery ministry and services, which is ARMS. I had found them because they had a flyer at my church. And I went and I was just like, man, the first 5 or 6 lessons, I basically sat there with tears pouring down my face. Number 1, because somebody actually got it. Somebody actually understood all of it. But number 2, because God had more planned for me. And he had, I went into leadership of those groups once I was healthy and able to do so. And during that time, he also walked me through deeper healing than what the program covers. And some of it was really difficult. And there was no book in the world, no curriculum in the world that covered any of this that he was taking me through. And I know, Megan, you've had that experience too, where it's just the Holy Spirit walking you through and telling you, it's time to work on this, it's time to work on that, and it's time to look at you. And it's not that addiction or mistreatment or even abuse are our fault when we're in that situation. It never is. However, some of the deeper healing, if you're going to go that far, means that you do need to look at yourself and you need to look at your own behaviors as well. And so a lot of that was difficult to walk through. I was like, oh, I thought I was done. And no, I'm not done. But it was so worth it. It was so worth it because after 3 relationships in that regard, I'm now in a healthy marriage and have been for 11 years to somebody who really treasures me, and I'm very grateful for that. My family was healthier when I got myself healthier and got myself, out of those things, and when I started taking care of God's temple, because that's what we are, and that's what really hit me is that by accepting these things in my life, from a partner or from a parent or from a friend or whatever, I was not treating the temple of Jesus that like he was even in there, even though he was. And I was certainly more precious to him, than that, as you are. And so it's been worth it to get out and to work hard and to help other people, but it's not an easy process, especially in the beginning when you're thinking about, should I go, should I not? Or maybe you hear from your church, are you sure things are you sure? Or you hear from family members, right? Are you sure you're not exaggerating? This person's a
Mm.
nice person. And you start to doubt that, yourself as well as your own value. It makes it extra hard to make any moves. But you can do it, and it's important that you do. And there's people that are experienced in it that can walk alongside of you during that process.
My story and your story are so similar, but I think it's because it's actually really very similar for a lot of people who find themselves in unhealthy relationships and just unhealthy dynamics in their life in general. I know for me, there was the side of me that was super driven and perfectionist and high achieving. And that looked on the outside, wow, look at what she's able to do and accomplish. And I took great joy and satisfaction as that is my identity. And then I had this side where I had unhealthy relationships from high school. I also had 2 unhealthy marriages. And like you, God said, what is the common denominator here? And it's not to dismiss that other people's harmful behaviors are in any way justified or that you're having to take on the responsibility of someone else's behavior, because that was part of my problem, is actually taking on more responsibility than I should in both the relationships and in my work and career. So they look different, but at the root of it, it was how I found my identity and my value. God had to help me see that while, yes, those things that you were in, those relationships were not healthy, the only thing that you actually have the ability to influence and change is yourself. It was a hard realization, but yet I knew it was true when he pointed it out to me. And he actually showed me that the way I was being codependent and manipulating and, in essence, not allowing the other person to have their free will because I was trying to control everything and get my needs met. He said to me, abuse is just taking away someone else's free will, and that he's not an abusive God, and that I'm not supposed to try to make someone be something that I want them to be in a relationship when that's not what they wanted. And it was a real eye opener for me because since the time I was 16 and then ended up in very unhealthy relationships after a sexual assault, I had seen myself as a victim. And
Mhm.
I was a victim of these things happening, but the victimhood and that mindset that I took on and not believing that I was ever going to be good enough to have the kind of husband that I hoped for and dreamed of when you're a little girl. And that kept me stuck
Mm.
and in a pattern of just repeating the same thing over and over again. So let's talk a little bit about patterns and how do you break those patterns? Because there's probably many people listening right now that are saying, okay, I recognize that I have dreams and I want this type of relationship or I want to be this type of mom, but I just can't get there. What do I do next? So, how did God start speaking to you and help you to kind of come out of those unhealthy cycles for yourself?
Well, first of all, I'm very sorry that assault happened to you. There's no excuse for that.
No,
And you're
thank
not
you.
alone in that. But you are correct. We tend to take on the mentality. When we take on a victim mentality, it halts our healing. And often it actually puts us backwards, in our healing.
That was me.
Yeah. And what you will find, the more you work with people, is that the people who are actually being the abusers or the addicted ones or the ones who are mistreating people also take on a victim mentality,
Mhm.
even though they are not truly the victims. It also stops their growth and their way to get out of their pattern of such that might be. So I think for starters, for me, I did not recognize or want to recognize my value. Now, to be fair, I'm a middle child. And as middle children, we already are overachievers and needy. So, like you, I was an overachiever. Well, you take that and you add trauma on top of that, right? Then you've got a massive overachiever and people pleaser because we spend so many years, you said walking on eggshells, which is a great term, but tiptoeing around, right? And adjusting our behavior in order to try to stop, the mistreatment and the addiction, right? We're like, if only I could be better. And then what do we do? Sometimes we have kids, right? And then we're busy guarding them and getting in the way of that. And God understands that. He absolutely understands that. What I do is I call that a survivor, mentality. That's where we're at. And I use an example of we lived at the coast many years ago, and we actually had a power outage that lasted for it was almost 7 days, and it made national news, and there were trees down and nobody could get supplies to us, and the stores were out of water and propane and all those things. What did I do? When I look back at it, I spent all my time figuring out a propane candle thing, cooking some kind of meal on that, for my family, and then heating up water afterwards and cleaning. And by the time I was done with all that, it was time to think of, the next meal. I went into survival mode. I went into, my whole being and my spirit and everything went to what was most important because that's what it does as a life saving measure. So you shouldn't feel guilty for spending so many years, you only know what or for tiptoeing around. But you do need to know that, if you're listening to this today, right, and you feel a little bit of nudge that God might be asking you, to look at breaking that pattern. And I have found patterns for me started in my childhood, and I did have some abuse in the home growing up. And I went into a very unhealthy early teenage relationship with an older man who never should have been available for that. And that started, that started me off, and that started me off a bit crooked. So like you, right, I had an event in my life that started me there, but within that relationship, I felt very valued. And so what did I do? I was a lifelong believer in Jesus, since I was 4, but I transferred that, my value from him, to how I felt in this amazing, relationship to somebody that valued me. And that just took me on a roller coaster. We'll just call it that, with all these relationships. So when I look back on patterns, value was key, and that was the first key for me, was truly recognizing, and I learned to recognize it several years ago now. I've been free of all that stuff for many years, but, when God took me up to heaven, a year and a half ago, I truly understood my true value to him, and he knew everything about me, and he knew what I did, and he knew that I wrote books, and he knew that I run recovery groups, and he knew all of this, and he's like, "Go back home, your work's not done." And I'm like, "Oh, okay," but just the way he looks at you, you're like, I am the most important person in the world to him. And that is how you feel. And that is how everybody will feel someday when you see him. So once you get home from something like that, it's like, I'm valuable and I know I'm valuable, right? So start acting like it. Start acting like it. Start expecting people to treat you well, to honor, to respect. Start setting those boundaries that you maybe have tried to set but don't follow through with, right? And you love that. We set consequences and then they talk us out of them, and all those things that happen, and work on yourself to be healthy. The Holy Spirit will walk you through your own path as far as what, that needs to be. And for me, it was a variety of things. I had self-medicated. I had people pleasing as a problem, not as much. People pleasing was low for me, but it was still there. I had that overachievement. I had that tiptoeing around. I couldn't trust anybody. Oh, this is a good one that I hear a lot of. I apologized for everything. Everything, right? Anytime somebody's like, da, 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 I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. And really took a concentrated effort to, Julie, stop. Was this your fault? No, this was not your fault. Okay, don't say, you're sorry. And sometimes we continue those things for years, but they're very self-depreciating, and it's not going to help our healing and getting out of the process. So, the program I took was very important in getting me through those first steps. And then, God took it further. There's things that beginning programs do not address, in my opinion. And part of the reason is because I think they're afraid to go deep, and they don't want to scare people off. And of course, we're very trauma informed, right? And abuse informed and trauma informed and addiction informed are all different things. But, they balance on the side of not addressing the issues within yourself or bringing those up to you because we're so, careful to be careful of victims and survivors. And that's not a bad thing. But eventually the Holy Spirit's going to work you around to the, point where you're like, what do I need to do? What do I need to do? What do I need to do? And as hard as that can be to accept, because, we have that pride, that human pride. Oh, that ugly human pride, right? You don't get far unless you decide to go on that journey. So, in my case, I had to go back to my childhood. I had to start, and in the last few years, it's been looking at things like generational sins and generational curses and what runs in my family and how I can even, like Nehemiah did, apologize to the Lord for my past generations of what they did and what they passed on, because sexual abuse was prominent in one side of my family, and so was alcoholism. And those things, if we don't address them, like the old days, they never did address them because, they were strict and good people. You don't do that, right? But if you don't address them, then it keeps going down the line. And so my goal really became not just to heal myself, but to heal it in our family so that we weren't passing this on to other generations.
So powerful. And I really appreciate the conversation around beginning healing looks different than when you start doing the deep healing. I know for me, the beginning healing, when I was just leaving my second marriage, and I had a domestic abuse advocate from the county I lived in, and she was so amazing. I consider her an angel that God gifted me, because I had been in counseling, but I wasn't being honest with everything,
Been
because
there.
I
Been there.
did, I I didn't want to actually acknowledge things on my side or on his side, because if I did, then something would have to change, and change is like, I know this situation. I don't know what not being in this situation is going to look like. And I don't even know if I'm not with him, and how am I going to raise kids and do all this on my own. And then probably no one's ever going to want me. I mean, look at me. I'm a mess. And because she was somebody who had been in an unhealthy relationship, she just understood me in a way that no one else could.
Mm.
Plus, I was having to be honest with her, because you don't get a domestic abuse advocate without somebody reported something and had them show up at my house with someone from the Department of Human Services. And that was a very humbling moment, because I had to recognize that they were there because they wanted to protect my kids. Wow, like, I am not protecting them by the choices that I'm making and the lack of boundaries in doing what's really hard, but was what really needed to happen. And she walked with me in that early healing, and then all of a sudden she was just gone. And I'm like, whoa, like God literally had her there just for these few months. And then he really started to take me into some really deep work. But I had stabilized. I wasn't doing this really deep work in the midst of still being in the unhealthy home. At that point, my kids were safe. I was safe. We were restarting our lives in so many ways. There was capacity for being able to go deep. And I had also been on a journey of understanding my value and what is my identity and who God says I am. That was allowing me now to have skills and have more self-compassion. And I also got into community with other women who had experienced really hard things and started talking more about my story. And that's why It's Your Story to Tell exists, is because there's so much power when people share their story and you can have compassion for them and they can have compassion for you. You can see things in them and they can see things in you. And I think one of the most amazing parts is just having someone sit with you in the middle of those hard stories, holding space and acknowledgement for the hard that you went through, because lots of people go through trauma. You do not make it out of this world without some sort of trauma happening, because there's just so many things in our world that impact us. But it becomes a cycle and a traumatic pattern when we haven't been able to heal from it. And then it continues, the impact continues, throughout other relationships and all these different aspects of your life. So having someone who can witness that and just hold space and have compassion and not judgment is so powerful to allowing the healing from those woundings all the way back to childhood too. And God eventually took me there as well. But it was a long process. This has been going on for now 10 years for me from the time that I left. And then now I am remarried to an amazing man who does love and value me, but I had to love and value myself
Right.
because of who I was in God. So I just love that you shared about how your experience of going to heaven and being in the presence of God allowed you to just see how much He loves you and He knows you, which is such a healing piece of trauma.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's important to note that not all people grow up in an environment that provides that, right? I mean,
Mhm.
we grow up with broken families and sometimes we grow up with abusive parents. And we also find that, people who grow up like with an abusive dad have a very hard time seeing the love of Jesus. So although some of us start out early knowing the Lord, right? Sometimes that traumatic event happens and it flips us, right? But then other times there's been some people that have never had that, in their lives,
Mhm.
and they're more prone to trauma in that way. But the results are the same. They still end up stuck like you and me, in unhealthiness, due to that. So yeah, it's important to recognize your worth, but you have to believe it yourself. You really do.
Mhm.
Anybody, you can sit in the class or whatever, and they can say, right, right, I'm important, I'm valuable 20 times on the blackboard, right? Or whatever on but that does not implant it in your head. You have to truly, believe it. And so I think that process is different for everybody. But if there's one thing I wish I could bottle from my heaven experience, it would be that. Um, I mean, our lives are recorded up there. All of our days, even the bad stuff, are recorded. He knows everything, and yet loves us so intimately, that our value and worth so intimately that his life will not be complete until we are all in heaven. He's very much, looking forward to having all his children in heaven, and that will be the best day for him and for us as well. But I do wish I could bottle that, because if people truly understood that, here's an example. My trauma left me with a lot of anxiety, let's put it that way, but a little bit of depression as well. It's pretty hard though to be anxious and depressed when you get back from heaven. I mean, you can be depressed because you miss being there and you miss him. And I did. I really struggled with that. But because all of a sudden you've experienced the fact that that is eternity and this is temporary, and whatever is happening
Mhm.
here, you truly understand it's finally that it's just a blip. It's just a blip. It's just a speed bump. You're going to step over it, and eternity with him is going to be so much. It is a priority, and it changes what you think, and changes how you think, and it changes how you see your value. So I do wish I could bottle that and bring it back to all the ladies that I work with, and the great hope that brings.
Well, we're going to talk more about how that heaven experience has brought you to where you are in bringing the Broken Souls Restored group together. I want to hear more about that. Also about your book. So come back and listen to Julie as she shares more in part 2. Thanks so much for being here.